Wonderful. And we're here on Storytelling with Seth. I'm sitting down with Danny Fingeroth. I'm excited to get the chance to participate for my first time in Will Eisner Week, and I'm lucky that I get to have a conversation with the chair himself, someone with a storied history in comics, and I'll allow him to make further introductions and allusions to a very impressive biography. Danny, say hello. How are you today, my friend?
Okay, Seth. It's great to be on. Your listeners may not know, but we just went through a exciting tech adventure to get to rig this up, and I'm pleased that if you're hearing this, you'll know that the adventure was successful. But it's very nice of you to have me on to talk about Will Eisner Week and my biography of some guy named Stan Lee.
I'm looking forward to it, but I'm going to point out that if you're not aware of Danny by any other means except for this conversation, I'm going to let you know he's displaying an impressive amount of modesty. The only reason we're actually able to get this recording done today is because my system failed, and he has an amazing, acute knowledge of how to create a backup system in about 10 minutes, somewhat MacGyverish, if you can recall that dated reference. And that's the reason we're actually able to pull this off. So, Danny, thank you for all your efforts and for saving me in a bit of a technical crisis.
Oh, well, as I said, if you're hearing this, you'll know that everything worked. I've done in my career, I've done a lot of interviewing in person and on convention panels and on telephones, and I have encountered many there's always a technical issue. There's never two situations that are the same, and you always think you've solved whatever tech issue you've had before, and then suddenly something new comes up. So this, as I say, I've had to improvise often on convention or university podiums with half a dozen other people and 1,000 people in the audience, and have to just sort of make believe that everything is fine and that nothing's going wrong, and then meanwhile I'm running in and out of rooms to try to get the tech crew of whatever venue it is to try to fix this thing that, say, it's almost always with a PowerPoint. If you're trying to show a PowerPoint slideshow, you could bring half a dozen adapters, right? And you could bring a laptop and other people in the audience. I've never seen it fail where you go somewhere where you just think, oh, well, this organization has a lot of presentations and speakers, so I'm sure they can use my basic PowerPoint that's on my not too outdated Mac laptop, and it always is, and it's often somebody in the audience who's some kind of tech hobbyist or something who goes, did you try plugging it in? Right, or something like that. Right?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that rare insight. You are the only one who considered that possibility. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Right.
Well, I'm going to start out really quick with the main reason we were first introduced to each other, which is about Will Eisner. And then I'd love to go into just the fact that as I, sort of preface this conversation, you do have an amazing history in comics. But let's start with Will Eisner, and then let's move into all the other parts that I'm looking forward to talking about. For starters, you are the chair.
I am the chair. I am not the desk. I am not the side table. I am not the tabaret. I am the chair of Will Eisner Week. Yes.
How long have you been the chair of Will Eisner Week? Is this your first round? Have you held this position for a while? I'm just sort of
it's been about 10 years. Yeah, it's been about 10 years, actually. Will Eisner Week, I guess I should explain who Will Eisner is, because is this, forgive my ignorance, is this a comics-oriented show in general, or is it a general pop culture show? Your podcast.
It's actually a story focus. My biggest thing is about storytelling, and one of the things I love is that I'll get a chance to introduce this later, but Will Eisner made an impression on me with one story that I constantly found referenced at points in my life, and it was really impressive for me that even though I don't have the extensive reading of his collection, anytime I see his work, the first thing that comes to mind is that first story I read. It had a very impressive impact on me.
Okay, I do want to hear about that. Yeah.
For anyone who's listening, I get a chance to share the fact that I'm also a co-host for the DC Comics News podcast, and I run a podcast as well called The Spinner Rack, which is where I pretend I'm at a interdimensional spinner rack of all the comics produced by DC Comics that week, and I choose 5, and I say, hey, from DC Comics, these are the 5 books I think you should be reading. So I share snippets of that on here as well, so people are generally aware of that. But I think even, some longtime comic fans, if they've only been staying in the more current, ideas of comics, might not be aware of who Will Eisner was, what he did, what he's responsible for. He's done to make an impact, like the story I was mentioning. But maybe you can give us a really great introduction.
Okay. Will Eisner is one of the maybe 5 or 10 people without whom there would be no history of comics. He's that important at numerous times in the history of comics, starting with in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But he went to high school with Bob Kane, who and with Bill Finger, I guess, the 2 guys who co-created Batman. They went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, New York. As did Stan Lee and a ton of people. You can look, from all sorts of different fields. Will was early into comics at all. When comics were even before Action Comics #1 in 1938, which introduced Superman, Will was writing, drawing, and packaging comic strips. And then he's best known for a character called the Spirit, who debuted in 1940 in the heart of the golden age of comics. The same 1940 was the 2 years after Superman, 1 year after Batman, the same year as Robin and the Joker and Catwoman, a year after Submariner, Human Torch, at Timely Marvel. Will really invented a lot of the visual and written vocabulary of comics. The Spirit was a kind of a noir adventure hero that was not for sale on the newsstands, except it was in newspapers. The way that I know a lot of people get their news digitally, but I would imagine most of your readers have seen newspapers, and the big, thick Sunday newspapers like the New York Times, the LA Times, Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, I guess, or the Chicago Sun-Times, but big papers. So there's like always an advertising insert, and there used to be a TV listing. Well, in 1940, when comics were becoming so popular, especially superhero-type action comics, there was a syndicate that engaged Will to do a comic book insert. So everybody worked for Will. Jack Kirby, of course, who co-created Fantastic Four and X-Men and Avengers, worked in Will's shop, as did Al Jaffe of Mad Magazine fame, the Mad Fold-In, and Jules Feiffer, the screenwriter and graphic novelist and political commentator. So all these people worked for Eisner, and the Spirit was kind of Eisner was sort of the Orson Welles of comics. Things were very dramatic and drawn from all sorts of exotic angles, and there were all sorts of strange characters. But it was also for an all ages audience. But comics of the era were more for kids, whereas the whole family read the newspaper. So the Spirit was this kind of two-fisted detective, but a lot of it was done tongue-in-cheek and satirically, and yet with a very heavy dose of film noir. So Eisner really invented a lot of the things we think of as comics, and he did the Spirit for 12 years, and millions of people read it, and then he took time off to do comics. He did military instruction manuals that would teach soldiers to not blow themselves up and to not literally shoot themselves in the foot, and a lot of kind of humor stuff and corporate comics, and kind of kept out of the spotlight until the early 70s, when he was introduced to some of the underground cartoonists like Dennis Kitchen and Art Spiegelman. And he kind of took from that. He realized, oh, there's an audience of people who grew up reading comics. They've outgrown superheroes, God forbid, and they have a sophisticated understanding of visual narrative, which Eisner calls sequential art. He coined that term, and and so he came out in 1978 with what's considered one of the first graphic novels. You know, we could debate all day about who invented the term graphic novel, what was the first, but certainly it was a series actually of 4 short stories put together under the title of A Contract with God. That was a groundbreaking thing. You know, so even if I think that, well, there's a book by Paul Levitz called Will Eisner, Champion of the Graphic Novel. And Eisner, not only did he put it on the map, but he really gave voice to a lot of other people. You know, you could say that he influenced Spiegelman and Pfeiffer himself, who just did a trilogy of graphic novels. But everything we think of as the modern graphic novel owes a debt to Contract with God. And then Eisner was, I guess, in his 60s when he put that out, just turned 60, and then he lived for another, more than 25 years, not only putting out pretty much a new graphic novel every year, but also, lending his name to the Eisner Awards that they give out at the San Diego Comic-Con, and then, for a long time, until he passed away, you would get an Eisner Award from Will Eisner. But he was an evangelist for comics and graphic novels and sequential art, and loved the medium, and was one of the first people back in the early 40s to even talk of comics as an art form, as opposed to a craft or a commercial form or an entertainment. I mean, he believed in it as all that too, but he really believed it had potential to be considered capital A art while still being entertaining. So he's really one of the key figures in the entire history of comics as a business and as a medium and as an art form. He was also one of the few people who early on, starting with The Spirit, retained the rights to his work. You know, there's a lot of horror stories about people who created these super popular characters and then signed them away the rights to them for next to nothing, and ended up in poverty and not really benefiting. So artists and writers, creators in general, are smarter about that stuff these days, but it's still hard to do because the big companies want to have your work for hire. Will was somebody who really understood how important it was to control the rights to your work, and he always did, and again inspired several generations to try to do the same thing. So anyway, Will was born March 6th, 1917. So every year, from approximately March 1st to March 7th, but really we've had stuff in February and stuff going into April, But Will Eisner Week every year is that week around his birthday, and it started with 1 or 2 events about 10 years ago, and Carl and Nancy Gropper, who run the Will Eisner studio and also the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation. So they honor and direct Will's legacy, and they came up with this idea for something, or maybe I think it was Charles Brownstein, actually, of the comic book Legal Defense Fund, who came up with this idea for let's celebrate Will Eisner with something called Will Eisner Week, and I moderated. I don't know if it was I put together and moderated the first event, which was in New York at the old Jim Hanley's Universe store on 33rd Street, and I got Will's high school best friend, a guy named Kenneth Ginniger, who I think recently passed away, but he was in pretty great shape for somebody in his 90s. Ginniger and Denny O'Neill and an academic named Chris Couch, and I'm forgetting, but a couple other people. And I guess Carl and Nancy were there, and they asked me if I would want to help them, grow and promote Will Eisner Week. So it's now here in 2020. We have, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 170 events worldwide. for Will Eisner Week. And when I say events, what I mean is it could be, say, people such as yourself who were generous enough to give us some time on their podcasts or radio shows, or what we ask of people for Will Eisner Week, which you can find at the Will Eisner website, willeisner.com, is that they do something. It doesn't have to be about Will specifically. It can be about pretty much any aspect of comics that you can sort of tie in, even tangentially, to Will's life and career, and so there's, all over the world, all over the country, there are, as I say, we've now gotten it. It's kind of mind-boggling to 170 events, which is, it's a tribute to Will. It's a tribute to how popular comics and graphic novels are becoming, and so that's kind of what Will Eisner Week is. And you can check at the WillEisner.com site, because there may very well be something going on in your town, at a university or school or library or comic shop. If there's not, maybe really, there's nothing stopping anybody from doing something for this year's Will Eisner Week. But if that's not enough notice, then certainly for next year, we'd love to have people do it. And then if you send us the information, we have a spreadsheet and we promote it, on our website. But really, it's so as I say, it can be about Will in particular or about comics, graphic novels. So I myself am doing a couple of events in New York, one at Parsons, the New School, for Ben Catcher's weekly comic symposium, and I'm doing something for a class at FIT, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. That was a very long answer. I apologize for that.
I don't want you to apologize at all. If you can make all of your answers that long or longer, I'm going to have a great time, and so is anybody else who's just, jotting away with their pen or pencil at all of this information that you so graciously just disclosed. What I love hearing is that you were part of one of the first, or the first panel, and then because of that, you were then approached and offered the opportunity to make this a annual occurrence for you and be part of Will Eisner Week every year.
It's funny how things happen like that, where, as I said, I think it was Charles Brownstein, who, just said, gee, wouldn't it be fun to celebrate, Will and graphic novels around his birthday with something called Will Eisner Week? And really, I guess it could have just stayed a local New York thing and just been that one year, but, everybody involved saw it, as something that had potential, to spread the word about comics. I think I know that Midtown Comics in New York is doing a Will Eisner Week sale, and I think other retailers are doing that. And as I say, Will was so passionate about comics and just the potential that what he called sequential art had. Yeah, it's kind of, when he had his centennial in 3 years ago in 2017, we kind of really put on a full court press, and part of my job my whole career has been politely nagging and annoying people to do stuff, as an editor and as a packager and so on. So and as a writer. So through kind of gentle persuasion, we got it. It was kind of appropriate for Will Eisner's 100th, what would have been his 100th birthday. We had around 100 events, and I thought, well, that's, we'll never, that it must be because it's his 100th birthday, and people like round numbers, and I wonder what'll happen. And now it's 3 years later, and we have another, 170. Events, that are branded as Will Eisner Week. It's taken on sort of a life of its own.
Which doesn't surprise me too much, because when I think about it, a lot of the underground comics were coming out of the West Coast, I believe, wasn't it? The underground comic scene was, and so I would imagine that cross-coast national appeal would exist for Will Eisner, given what he was able to later do in what some would consider his retirement years. Given if you were a 9-to-5 guy in your 60s, suddenly putting out the graphic novel that encourages others to now, again, take another fresh look at comic books and to see how the medium can grow up, how it can present itself for those who have grown up with comics and are looking for a next evolution or a next chapter in sort of the growth and development of comics as an idea. It doesn't surprise me that the moment they caught wind of Will Eisner Week, there was this desire to go, hey, we over here love him too. We would love to be a part of this. How can we, lend our ears, our voices?
Right, and of course in Europe and France, Eisner, graphic novels in general, but Will in particular, very popular in Italy and South America, in France.
Now that you bring
Spain,
that up, how many of your events are international?
I wish I had the answer to that, but I would say
that's okay.
I'd say maybe 25% of them. I'm not sure, but that's a great question, and I should get back to you with that information. But quite a few. He really was internationally known, and went to comics festivals and conventions all over the world. I mean, it's funny when you say, what I sometimes say about comics, in a sort of bittersweet way, is that it's one of those fields where, where nobody retires. You may die in your 50s from the sedentary lifestyle, and inhaling all those ink and whiteout fumes and stuff. But it's not a field where. So Will, Will never stopped. I think he was, if not literally then figuratively, even, in the hospital as, he was having some health issues near the end of his life, was still drawing. He still had, a graphic novel he was working on called The Plot about, an expose about the anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that he was very dismayed had found renewed popularity, even though it's a completely made-up thing. So he did a graphic novel that did a lot of research for it. So he was not a guy that the word retirement, just like Stan Lee, just like so many of Steve Ditko, Robert Crumb is still producing. There's just people. I think when you have something to say and you have the skills to do it, there's no such, I think Will had a very nice lifestyle. He I think even again towards late in his life, he was playing tennis on an almost daily basis, but he was not retiring in any sense of the word.
No, certainly not. And I love that story of the idea of just, even in a hospital bed, still, got work to do. Not just going to lay around here.
Right.
Once you're done with your poking and prodding and testing and all, please give me my materials back. And I'll get back to work.
Yeah, that was Will, and that was that was Stan Lee told. There's stories about Stan. Even though literally days before he died, even though he could hardly see or hear, just sort of being in on story conferences, and if that's. Stan used to say, when people would say, why don't you retire? He would say, well, people retire to do what they want to do, but I'm doing what I want to do. So, please don't make me stop.
That's really great. I'm also just intrigued because you brought up an interesting thing, which I've had a chance to touch base on and have a little bit of contact with, this idea of who actually started the first graphic novel. I made contact with a artist who is local to me when I discovered one of his pieces, of all things, hanging up in the bathroom of a restaurant that I went to. And there was something about it that stuck with me, so I inquired. It turns out there's a gentleman. Do you know the name Jack Katz?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Sorry, what's your knowledge of Jack?
Oh, well, he did a lot of historical graphic novels. But he was active in the 50s and 60s. I know at one seminar I went to at the Billy Ireland at the grand opening for the Billy Ireland Comic and Cartoon Museum at the University of Ohio in Columbus, which is a great museum. If you ever, I mean, if you ever happen to be in Columbus, go to it. But it's even something that, even if you don't happen to go to Columbus, is worth planning a trip to Columbus. It's a great museum and archive. But I was speaking at the on Will Eisner, oddly enough, I think maybe in 2013, when they had the grand opening. And there was a comics historian and scholar named Andrew Kunka, who'd done a lot of research on correspondence between Eisner and Jack Katz. So Katz, I forgot his most famous thing, but it's a history. Do you know the name offhand? Tell me.
His most popular book is the called The First Kingdom.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And that was, it's this long, eon-spanning narrative that follows the history of a planet and a people, and it touches on huge cosmic ideas. It goes from, the ideas of spirits representing different values and other concepts to families that, exist over thousands of years. There's destruction and rebuilding, and it seems to be very cyclical. That seemed to be one of the biggest things I found when I got a chance to sit down with Jack for about 3 interviews and talk about, the fact that he's 92 now and still plugging away. He was working on it. Yes, he is. Had some interesting stories to share, struggles at time to, really sort of get all the way in there for a longer, discussion about one topic, because at 92, it's like, well, it all ties together, so let me tell you about all these different things that might not connect to that. But it was a really interesting conversation. He told me about Andrew Kunka. I had a chance to touch base with him and learn about his Project Muse, and about the article he wrote, which is A Contract with God, The First Kingdom, and the graphic novel, and he bases it on the Will Eisner, Jack Katz letters.
No, that's right.
So I was really intrigued with the opportunity to talk with you, to have you bring that up, to know that this was something that I had a chance to have some exposure to, and, some framework as we moved into the idea about the graphic novel and, Jack's take on it, and how he feels it measures up, and in his belief, the article, the paper written by Andrew Kunka, supports his claim that he was the first to it, and it's a title he holds proudly.
Will never claimed he was the first. It's one of those things where I think, especially say the mainstream reporters, or just as shorthand. If somebody's introducing Will at to speak at a synagogue or something, or at a college class where it's not specifically about, where it's not a crowd that necessarily has a deep background in comics. To say that Will Eisner is the father of the graphic novel or the inventor of the graphic novel is one of those things that gets said. Although Will just as shorthand or for convenience, but Will never claim that. Will's anecdote about it, which he told a lot, was when he had been working on A Contract with God. He called up a publisher that he knew, and he knew if he said to the guy, I have a new long-form comic book, that the guy probably wouldn't see him. So according to Will, he was on the phone, and the guy said, "Hey, Will, what do you got? You sound really excited about it." And Will said, "I got a graphic novel." So I think Will, I think probably in different accounts it comes out differently. I think he claims that he coined the phrase, but doesn't rule out that somebody else might have used it years before as well. What year did Katz say that he started using the term?
I'd have to go back through and nail it down. I believe it was in 1974 he claims that he started sharing with Eisner his idea for the First Kingdom. So that, the idea was, hey, in Jack's story, he and Will were having a conversation, and it was one where he said, this is what I'm thinking of working on. And then it was around that time that he sort of references it during their correspondence. He says, yeah, it's not just going to be a big, long comic book. It's going to be like a novel, like a graphic novel was the term that he coined in one of their letters to each other. And so...
Yeah, I think maybe was it somebody named Richard Kyle who people credit with using the term in the 60s, and then I think Byron Price used it for a line of kind of a paperback comic originals that he did in the 70s. That Chandler by Steranko and Shlomo Raven by Tom Sutton. And I think maybe Byron himself wrote it. It's what, like I said, and really, graphic novel is in a way as vague as comic book. I mean, both of those terms are sort of, people know it. I mean, we're at the point now where it's become that, I guess the term has become so respectable that, say, you'll have children's art classes or something where somebody will call a 2-page comic a graphic novel. Well, I don't know if that, I don't know if that was either Jack or Will's or anybody else's intention, but I guess when comic book, to this day, I guess because I've been in this business, my whole career, and read them as a kid, my antenna are attuned to it, but not a week goes by where you don't read somebody using the word comic book or comic booky as in a derogatory way. That movie was so stupid it was like a comic book. That that explanation was so infantile. It was like a So I think the term graphic novel is certainly one that people try to use to give more respectability to what Will, and again, I don't even know if Will, I think Will did coin the term sequential art, although I'm sure, somebody could go through, archives and libraries and find some, use of that term before possibly, but, I think that there was, as I recall, the correspondence between Will and Jack was cordial. I don't, it seemed that they both felt there was a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, I don't see that there was, anything but just a mutual respect between two artists talking about the ideas, talking about the stage in their lives. Just for a brief, history on Jack, he worked with Jack Kirby. He worked with Stan Lee. He's most well known as far as popular figures for before doing the First Kingdom for working on characters like Bullet Man. As he mentions it, Bullet Woman was okay to draw. Bullet Dog was his favorite. And then some interesting ideas, many of which were similar to other ideas that either came out before or after, and it was kind of about timing when, and how some of his original ideas either did or didn't get picked up for works. He seemed to have quite a grasp on the different styles as comics moved from, the 40s, 50s into the 60s and 70s, whether he was working on like horror suspense or classic superhero or things like that. But at some point there was a break in his career where I didn't see as much work, and then later it seemed to resume a bit with the First Kingdom. And then the First Kingdom just became this long, sprawling, I think it's like an 8 or 9 volume, I can never get the number correct in my head, collection, and each book is hundreds of pages. And last he was working on was a sequel to that called Beyond the Beyond.
Wow.
And last contact with him was that he was completed that, and now it was on to something else.
Incredible.
And I was intrigued because he mentioned some questions that he wanted to answer in the book, and I asked, when I touched base, like, hey, did you get a chance to answer those questions? He's like, well, that's what the next book's for. Oh, okay. So, it's really interesting that I feel like, in that way it seems like so many other artists, and we can, touch on the fact that, your experience as a writer and artist, what that means for you. But you're always trying to tell the story, but just because you told it the best you could one time doesn't mean you're not always trying to tell it again better in a new way, to get closer to the ideas, or, tell it with new characters that can inform it more than you were able to the first time, or having completed something go, okay, but next time this is how I'm going to do it.
I saw a great quote the other day that I feel bad that I can't remember who said it.
That's okay.
I've been involved in biography most recently in my writing career, and so I've been reading a lot of essays and websites and writings by biographers, so consider the source. But the quote is something like, "There's no such thing as fiction or nonfiction. There's only memoir." Which means, kind of what you were just saying, that that as humans and as people who do creative things, we probably have one or two or three topics we're obsessed with, and then we find different ways to express those topics, whether we're aware of it or not. Eisner always, I think, Eisner being Eisner, was aware, at least of one topic that he was always coming back to, which was survival. Human survival in the world, whether it be the spirit surviving as a crime fighter, or the desperate characters that he often portrayed in his graphic novels, the people struggling to get out from the challenges of their lives, or the people who were exploiting them, or he did a story literally about a guy having a dialogue with a cockroach, who are famous for being the ones who will survive us all at the end of time, or about and then Will became very interested in the topic of Jewish survival, especially at the end of his, in the second half of his career, starting with some of the stories in Contract, and then going through The Name of the Game, and to The Heart of the Storm, up until the plot at the end. So it was, I don't think he was didactic or overwhelming in his, I think he always wanted to be an entertainer and an educator. But Will, I think, was self-aware enough to realize that survival is sort of at the heart of what we do every day. The fact that we get up you get up in the morning, and you think you're going to come back home at night, but you don't really, that's right. It's really, we're all operating on a big leap of faith that, but then you go, well, if I just stay in the house, though, something could happen to me in the house too, so why not go out? But I think that whole, I think Will was very aware of that that kind of human issue of survival that is, on the one hand seems very simplistic, and yet is also very profound.
I think so as well. I think he captured that idea that, it can seem so simple when you're just going through it day to day, and then suddenly when there's a change, all that simplicity gets reevaluated, reexamined, and you're suddenly, overwhelmed or confronted with the complexity of it all. And suddenly it becomes this much more complex idea of, all of the things that could be working against you on a daily basis that you're navigating, whether it's the cars on the road, as a driver, as a pedestrian, as a person in any place at any given moment, what could happen.
Well,
and what could suddenly change all that?
But he had. By the way, the thing I'm doing on March 3rd at the Parsons is I'll be having a discussion.
And it's the story of Gerhard Schnabel.
That's a great story.
Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with Gerhard Schnabel. Yeah.
That struck me. I was a young kid in my local library, which didn't have much of comics. There was only one comic book store in town. It was run by two brothers. It was called De Hoyo's Comics. And I would bike down there like once a week, surrender whatever amounts of my paper route money. I still had a paper route. This was in a day when you could still have a paper route in a small town like that. And I remember that I could only spend so much money, but I still wanted to also understand how it was people knew so much about these different characters. And I'd only grown up with DC, so I didn't understand what so much was about Marvel that I needed to learn. So I came across a book about the history of comics, and it was this huge, thick thing in the library, and I was like, you got to be kidding me. So I remember I took a day in the summer and just went there for like an hour or two and just sat there reading it. And that was where I learned about Gerhard Schnabel. And they had reprinted the story in this book, and as I'm reading it over, my heart just broke at this idea of this character and flying, and how it seems so jarring when compared with the story of the Spirit trying to track down these criminals. And it was a really amazing thing that I'd never seen done in comics before. And I've been reading for a few years, and I liked the stuff that I was reading because it was the only thing I knew, and it was bright and cool. And I got into comics in the early 90s, so I was exposed to a lot of the extreme, the Jim Lee, the big, like, really in your face, everything's over the top, everybody has unbelievable muscles and perfect bodies. But then reading through this stuff that I saw from Will Eisner, everything about it seemed much more simple, and yet at the same time so much more human. Right. There was a gravity that I always associated with the cover to A Contract with God. It felt like the characters were wearing the world and the atmosphere around them on their bodies. And it was powerful. I later remember hearing a Pearl Jam song called Given to Fly, maybe 8 to 10 years after I discovered that story. And immediately was like transported back to the library in front of that book, reading that story. And I don't even know if the two are connected. I thought in my own head, I'm like, of course it's what it is. Of course it's what it is. But also this fact that any other time someone would say Will Eisner, I was back there reading this story, watching this guy fly, watching him experience something that no one else would know because of the tragic circumstances of the story. And I'm built into that culture where you don't give spoilers, and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, so many thousands of people have read this story, I'm not going to spoil it.
It is a story that came out in 1948, so I don't know if the spoiler alert is really, I understand though, right?
Yeah, there's a desire in me that whoever comes across this recording, whoever comes across that story, it's not in some way tainted by what I'm trying to share about it, which is just this amazing feeling of, oh man, I can't believe that was so powerful and doing so much with so little. It seemed like, I was exposed to all these over-the-top ways of telling stories and trying to get your attention. And in this one story, it just grabbed my attention and held on. And I was just really moved by it. And that was my first exposure to what Will Eisner could do, and how my reverence for his work was just cemented in that moment. I was like,
that's a great exposure. Well, without giving away the ending, I mean, the story, for people who haven't read it, is about a guy who, as a child, discovers that he can fly, and but his parents are embarrassed and ashamed over it, and they tell him, "Don't ever do that," and sort of and then the story then moves to his later life and his interaction with the Spirit and criminals in Central City, which was Eisner's very thinly veiled New York City.
Right. And I'm intrigued also because I'm reminded also, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the animated shorts that they have with Pixar that have become really popular, almost as popular as the movies themselves.
Sure.
And there's one streaming now on the Disney platform, and it's called Float.
I don't know if I've seen that one.
It's gained a lot of notoriety because it focuses on a Filipino family.
Right.
And it's a father and a son, and the son floats. He just sort of hovers in the air and kind of dances around. And the father at first is amazed by it, but then at one point he does it in public, and it freaks him out. So he gives the kid a backpack and loads it up with rocks and to keep him grounded. And then at one point they're in a park, and the kid suddenly, loses his backpack, and he's flying in the middle of the park, and all the parents are terrified, and the father freaks out, And in that moment, he sort of, is frustrated and terrified for his son. And the interaction that follows is a really, lovely experience about understanding and accepting, the brilliance that we are. But as I was watching that, again, I thought to myself, wait a minute, this is the story from Will Eisner about someone who could fly. Right. This is, that connection was instantaneous, even though it's been, some 25 odd years later, and how it points to this great concept, having an amazing ability, keeping it a secret, wanting to share it with the world, and then the heart sort of wrenching loss that can go with it.
Well, I think it goes back to Eisner's own childhood. If you read some of his more memoir-like work, like To the Heart of the Storm, or the or the one that's the kind of thinly fictionalized version of The Dreamer, that's a kind of history of the comics business. You can see that for a kid growing up in a tough ghetto situation, that to be an artist, right? On the one hand, it's a talent that people kind of admire, and they like it if you can draw, airplanes or rocket ships or superheroes. But it kind of also has, I guess, the taint of being a little bit of not macho enough, or he's a sissy, or you can beat him up and steal his lunch money. I think, Gerhard Schnabel, I'm sure I'm not the first person to think this, but it is the first time I'm thinking it. I think it does tie into anything where you're special or different. I've written a couple of books kind of about that. One called Superman on the Couch, what superheroes really tell us about ourselves and our society, and also disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, comics, and the creation of the superhero. And they're both about how, with different emphasis in each, on how the idea of being, often from an immigrant family and having these different skills, and just being different because your parents are not born here and they speak with a funny accent, is a mixed bag, and I think maybe Schnabel was, maybe Will even commenting on what it was like for him to be different and have that, that drive and that skill to draw and to tell stories, So I think it comes from from a profound place.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of a great conversation I heard recently between a couple of comic book writers. I'm trying to think who the other was, but I know one was Tom King, who's gotten a lot of notoriety recently.
Right.
And he was talking about his run on. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of his work. My father has a bit of an illness, so I was home visiting him for free comic book day.
Sorry to hear that. Yeah.
And thank you. But I had to task my wife with the responsibility of getting me some free comics.
Oh, sure.
Because I wasn't going to be there. And so she did, and to my delight, the staff was really helpful. And when she said, "What can I get him that's a surprise that he'll absolutely love, even though he wouldn't expect it," and they said, "Oh, you should get him the Mr. Miracle graphic novel. He'll really love that." And I've actually had a chance to read it prior to that. She didn't know that. I just read it on my own.
Right.
And I was moved by something he'd mentioned in the interview, and I felt that when he mentioned it, I could see it in the work that I'd read from Mr. Miracle, about how he's like, look, there just comes a point where you just stop trying to be as creative as possible, and you start drawing on the elements from your own life that you know are going to make the most sense or that fit the best in this story.
Right.
And it feels like that's something that Will was able to identify at an early time in the birth of comics, and able to use to great effect, not just in the story of Mr. Schnabel, but later to more powerful effect in The Contract with God, Heart of the Storm. And throughout his career, there's probably numerous other examples that we could point to. And that was a way that he could, use those parts of himself that needed to be addressed in some way, and use the stories as a way to address them, to work them out, to process them, or to simply say, hey, look, if you guys are just going to keep being in my way, I'm just going to use you in stories as much as, as much as I have to, or as much as it takes for.
Yeah, that sounds right. There's a period for him, or really be a presentation by and then a discussion with me, with John Lind, who was the designer and editor of Contract with God, a curator's collection, which it came out from Dark Horse, I think about in 2018. But it's Eisner, for Contract with God, inked it all on overlays, so that now some of it was with collectors, but basically all the pencil work and all the preparatory work exists for it, and then separately all the inking and lettering exists. So John put together this incredible edition that we're going to be talking about. But in so Contract with God, if you that really is literally Eisner 101, and then maybe the best of the spirit if you want to read some of the stuff from the 40s. There's in DC at one point, DC Comics put out all the spirit stories in like 25 different volumes. But so there's a lot of Eisner out there. But one of the things that impelled him to do Contract with God, which he didn't reveal till shortly before he himself passed away, was that he had a daughter who passed away as a teenager in 1969 when she was around 16 from leukemia. And the lead story, the title story in Contract with God, is a disguised, it's a metaphoric version of that. It's about a religious Orthodox Jew who loses a daughter, and sort of the life crisis it brings about for him. So I think Eisner, for him, survival was not abstract. He'd served in the army during World War II. Obviously, the Holocaust was an incredible shock and traumatic event for him, as for the world, and for Jews in particular. But having his daughter die young, I think, really kind of shattered his world in a way he didn't let on to anybody. It really was not till years later that anybody outside his closest circle of family and friends knew that him writing and drawing about survival was not just an abstract thing.
Mm. It's an impressive thing when I think about not only the idea of trying to describe and portray survival, but then when you add in this personal layer about his own connection to what it means to press on when the impact is so close, so personal.
Right.
And then at some point to find a way with your art to give that story a place to live on, because anyone who picks up that story from now on can, give it a new life shared with a new person. But it also impresses me because when I think about how many people will eventually discover that story and read it, and how many who have already discovered it but now have this added knowledge to it, how much more that's going to lead them to go back and reread. For me, this sets up the fact that I mentioned at the beginning that Will Eisner actually made an impact on me because of a story from the Spirit.
I mean, it's funny, I just sort of thinking back to what you're saying about Jack Katz sort of disappeared for a while. Well, a lot of people disappeared in the 50s when there was the whole anti-comics movement. And a lot of people, if you've seen David Haydu's book, The 10-Cent Plague, he has pages, page after page in the back of the book with lists of people who, left comics either willingly or unwillingly in the early and mid 50s, and it's kind of some people would leave just to go on to other things or to have families or whatever, but a lot of and Will, I think, very wisely, Will got out of mainstream comics really in 1940. I mean, he still did some work and did the Black Hawk work and other things, and Spirit was reprinted, but his main concern for the 40s and until to 1952 was the Spirit section, which had other, 3 other features as well as the Spirit every week. But I think so. I guess whatever Jack, but so he ended up being out of the heart of the storm, so to speak, and took him more than 20 years to come back to comics that were not done on a commission basis for a client. So I imagine something similar might have happened with Jack Katz, who just found the industry capsized. There was a lot of the horror comics were the targets of people like Frederick Wortham and so on. But even comics that that were benign, that were just Bigfoot, funny animal comics, got caught up in the same undertow as the over the top horror comics. So I think I'm not sure if that ties into what you just. It sort of vaguely ties into what you just said, but I think the Eisner's influence on everybody. I mean, he is one of those few people that even if they don't know it. I mean, that's the funny thing. I think there may be generations who don't even know they were influenced by Eisner, but they were influenced by people influenced by Eisner. Just I think Jack Kirby is similar in that way. People you don't even, if you're talking about the image era, and I guess if that was sort of your first, you were fortunate and also smart enough to pick up on the fact that even though you were, into the image guys and whatever Marvel and DC were doing, that oh yeah, there had to be somebody before this, and here's this, you found a history book, and you kept going back to the library to read it, so, so
that was one of the best discoveries I ever made. Just finding that book and realizing that history.
Which book was it?
My brain's not going to recall it right now. In fact, as I was trying to, I was opened a tab or two, like where can I find this history of comics book? And the title is lost to me at the moment. Yeah. But it was really comprehensive because it showed a lot of the underground comics. It had some great reprints of some really interesting, for me at the time, out there stories. There was one story about a world of comic book characters that were no longer needed, and how they'd all been cast to this kind of like Phantom Zone existence and wandering around looking for ways to sort of just exist without having any relevance. And
I'd love to know.
Sort of, I'm going to come across it, and when I do, and I'll do a little research, I'll find that. But it covered, Zippo. It covered a lot of just different ideas about what comics could and couldn't be. It touched on Shlomo. It showed all these different elements.
Huh. And, I'd be curious to know. Please. For my generation, it was Jules Cypher's great comic book Heroes. That book really, I've been reading comics, for years. That came out in '65, and I knew there had been comics before, but there was no real way to see them. I mean, you could see the Batman and Superman annuals would reprint stuff, but Pfeiffer, who had worked for Eisner, and one of the reasons he even did that book was to kind of put Eisner back in people's consciousness, printed a Spirit story, and I'd never heard of the Spirit, and that was really mind-blowing, along with all the other stuff. You ever read that book, Pfeiffer's book?
I know of the title. I should get my hands on it.
It's a great book. You can... you should try to find, the original version or a reprint because it has the comics in it. But there is a version that Fantagraphics put out that's just the text, which is great to read too. But obviously, having the comics with it would be a bonus. But that was really, I mean, maybe the Lupoffs or maybe some other people had done books, but that really. There was that, and then the Steranko History of Comics, those 2 volumes. Those are real eye openers. That was
okay.
Even though, I mean, it's funny to think about, because right now I am much older than when Will Eisner first started being the grand old man of comics. He was like 52. but I mean, of course, all these guys started when they were 16, 17. So by the time you got to be 52, you would have had like a 40-year career already. I don't know if I did the math right, but I mean, it was.
I'm not a math major, never was, never claimed to be,
no.
Need help with my taxes on a regular basis.
Well, sure.
Danny, I love the fact that you brought up, when you were first exposed to this, book by Jules that then introduced the Spirit to you, because it allows me to sort of talk about your history a little bit. You said you'd been reading comics for a while up until that time. When did you get into comics? Because you have a history that I would love to move the conversation into a bit. We could probably spend 2 more hours talking about what Will's done for us and how we see his influence throughout. But there's also the person who's holding the title of chair. And that's the reason, I wanted to get in touch with you was, one, because you've also already had an experience within comics that, well, Danny, the first thing I'm going to say, and I'll let you lead up to that, but I actually have the first issue of Dark Heart Comics. It was a really fun book for me, but knowing that I was getting to sit down and talk with you and that I would get a chance to hear not only your history working in comics, but how you first got exposed to. When did you start reading comics? How long had you been reading before you discovered the Spirit? And then tell me about your own time working in comics.
Okay, so in 25 words or less. I'm one of those dreaded baby boomer guys. So I was born in the 50s, and I started reading comics probably when I was about 5. People always ask me, what was your first comic? And I was so young. I think it was a Popeye comic because I was a fan of the Popeye cartoons that were shown on TV a lot when I was a kid. So I think my mom must have bought me some Popeye comics, and then my cousin Steve shortly thereafter, I know, gave me some like old Superboy and Adventure comics. But I was certainly reading them by 5, 6, 7. I was an early reader in general. I think partly because of comics, or largely because of comics. Because as this may be familiar to you or to some of people listening. When you read comics, you really end up with a much larger vocabulary than the average kid, and reading skills that are often put you at the top of your class. Just thanks to comics, really. So I was reading the DC. I was a big superhero guy. I definitely early on glommed onto that fantasy. Maybe it was because of the George Reeves Superman TV show, or I don't know what. There was something about those costume characters that really grabbed me, and I was reading all that a lot of DC, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash. Some of the tangential stuff like Rip Hunter, Time Master, and but largely, I read a lot of comics, but superheroes are my favorites. And then, I had 2 or 3 friends who were also into comics in a big way. Everybody read Archie or something for a year or 2, but as far as people who really, people who haunted the candy store, which is where they sold magazines and comics when I was a kid in New York. So people who haunted the candy store waiting for the proprietor to cut the wire on the bundle of comics, so that we could get them first. Because they'd get them in the morning or the night before, and it wasn't a big priority to them. So we kind of go in and make them cut the metal wire that was holding the package of comics. And so a friend of mine said there's this new thing called the Fantastic Four that that's really pretty cool. So I found Fantastic Four issue number 4, the one where the Submariner returns, and that was my first Marvel comic. And I read in a pretty dedicated way till I was a teenager, and I think Marvel was changing at that point. Kirby had left. Stan, I think, was in many ways not focusing as much as he had been on the comics. the size of the paper the artists were using changed. A lot of things changed at the same time as I was becoming an adolescent. So I'd say in the early 70s, I dropped them. I got more into the underground comics, into stuff like Harvey Pekar. But probably in 1965 was when Great Comic Book Heroes came out, and that's when I discovered the Spirit and Eisner, and then was fascinated when Harvey Comics put out a bunch of reprints, and then when Warren Publishing and then Kitchen Sink put out various Spirit reprints, and then I started working at Marvel in 1977, working for Stan Lee's brother Larry Lieber in the British department, which was a
How did that happen?
Well, I graduated. I went to college. I studied filmmaking, but sort of in a kind of film as fine art program, as opposed to film as commercial blockbuster program. It was a very interesting. I studied with people, including a guy named Ken Jacobs, who was Art Spiegelman's mentor at Binghamton University. So I had always maintained something of an interest in comics, and I came back home after I graduated college, and for me, home was Manhattan. I'm, as your listeners can no doubt tell, I am a suave, sophisticated, urbane fellow, and also very provincial. Because that's my joke, is that I'm I've spent my entire life pretty much, except for when I went away to college and did some traveling, on the island of Manhattan, which makes me the most provincial person you'll ever meet in your life. So, it's like, what? Cross the water? I don't know. So I came back home, and I thought, it might be interesting to work at, Marvel Comics. It was interesting. I didn't say it might be interesting to work in comics. I specifically thought, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics, and I knew somebody who got me in the door for an informational tour, and while I was there, I ran into somebody that I went to high school with, and eventually, I ended up through those, combination of connections and luck. I mean, I couldn't say the connections. As I said, it was a guy I hadn't seen since high school, and but I ended up. So Larry had just been working at a company called Atlas Seaboard, which is a whole other story. But he had come back and was in charge of putting out some new material, mostly a character called Captain Britain, but most of what we put out was reprints in black and white of American comics divided into chapters, because there was a market in Britain for that. Things like 2000 AD and Beano, if you know any of those names. So we were
one of the guys I podcast with is from England, and he loves to tell us the stories about all the different ways marketing practices were sort of applied when it came to shipping them overseas.
Right, exactly. So this was, I think the real hardcore fans wanted the actual color American comics, but for just an average kid who liked comics and liked the Marvel characters, these reprint editions were cheap, and they came out, on a bi-weekly basis or weekly basis. And Star Wars was very big. That was when Star Wars was starting, and they were using the material in England at a faster pace than they were in America. So I was the assistant on that, and then that evolved into a job in the mainstream editorial department as a shared assistant to a guy named Sal Brodsky and to Jim Shooter, and then eventually I ended up working with Louise Simonson in the X-Men office as her assistant. Then I became the editor of Spider-Man, a couple of different periods in the 80s and the 90s. I did a ton of freelance writing, including, as you mentioned, the Dark Horse comic, of which I wrote every issue. I wrote a lot of Spider-Man, and so I'm probably best known in the mainstream comic world as the group editor of Spider-Man, and so I was running the Spider-Man line when it had like 17 or 18 Spider-Man related titles coming out every month. And then since then, I've written books about comics. I teach about comics. I packaged and edited a magazine called Right Now with a W for Tomorrow's Publishing, which was kind of Writer's Digest for comics. And I guess the thing that I've done most recently that I wanted to talk to a little was about Will Eisner's friend Stan Lee. Will and Stan. They didn't go to high school together, but they were of that basically similar generation. Will, I think, was maybe 5 years older than Stan, and I think they knew and admired each other. At one point, Stan tried to get Will to be the editor of Marvel when he wanted to step down. Or to be, I think, to be more the publisher. Not so much. I think Stan wanted to do stuff more involved with movies and TV, and I think he thought it would be in good hands. But Will was not a superhero guy by any means, and he also was not a fan of the work for hire situation. Will believed that people should own the rights to their work, so that didn't work out. But anyway, I knew and worked both at Marvel and at other companies with Stan for 40 plus years. So I wasn't Stan's closest friend, but I was a colleague that he liked and knew and trusted. So I have written a biography of Stan Lee called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, that came out in November from St. Martin's Press, Macmillan, and it's available everywhere. At comic shops, at bookstores, at Amazon, at Barnes and Noble, and it's been very well reviewed. Even people who, obviously there was friction between Stan and some of his artists, especially Kirby and Ditko, and disagreement over who was fairly credited and fairly rewarded. So even people who may not love Stan have told me they thought I did a fair and equitable job in presenting the different parts of the story. So it's a book. It's got 300 footnotes, because I figure when you're writing about Stan, you got to be careful where you cite everything, and so if you're interested in Stan, Marvel, history of comics, history of pop culture in America, the '60s, but it really talks about Stan's life from his birth in 1922. I go through a lot of his earlier career that people may not know much or anything about. A lot of the interesting things Stan did that had nothing to do with Marvel. And his relationships with his creators and his family, and so it's a real, it's an actual prose biography that you might want to check out.
Yeah, I would love to. In fact, if you wouldn't mind teasing us with just, you meet people and at some point they do something that's quintessentially them, or maybe even completely out of character, and you think to yourself, I'm going to write a book one day. And it can be, it can be the embarrassing, it can be the exemplary. Is there one of those moments that as you were writing the book, you were thinking to yourself, I finally get to tell this story about Stan that either nobody knows, everybody knows, or I've just been wanting to tell?
Well, it's a thing that happened. There was a period in the fairly recently, from around 2013 to 2017, I was working for the Wizard World convention chain, and everybody knows what a comic convention is. Wizard was a chain. They had and they still do. They still are around. They have about maybe 15 conventions a year, and they seem to specialize. They have Chicago and Philly, but otherwise kind of smaller cities like Tulsa and Nashville, where there's and Stan was involved with them, and for a couple of years I was his regular moderator, and because I knew him and he knew me, and so. At one, I think it was in Sacramento, a few years before he passed away, he was scheduled to be there on Saturday and do a panel. He would do like a paid thing, where if you wanted to be in a small group and get stuff signed, you would pay some fee. But he also did a panel that was just free and open to anybody who was at the convention. So that was where I was going to be his moderator, and he was late by a day. And I think the convention sent a plane from Sacramento to L.A. to get him, and he had a bad reaction to a flu shot, and so was kind of knocked out. And I could see so he came a day late, and then the president of the Wizard Company gets up And he says, look, he says, you guys know Stan was supposed to be here yesterday, but he had that reaction to the flu shot, so he's a real trooper, and he didn't want to disappoint you guys, but he's only going to do 20 minutes. He's not going to do the full 45-minute panel, just 20 minutes. And I'm sure you understand, and it's great that he's here at all. So here's Stan and Danny, and we came up, and there's applause, and and Stan, and I could see before Stan, while he was backstage, I could see he was not feeling well, and he had to hold tightly onto the banister to get up the 4 steps of the stage. Mm. And we're sitting there and chatting, and it was going, perfectly fine. And everybody, people are flashing me signs, 15 minutes to go, 10 minutes to go, 5 minutes to go. That's it. Stop it. So I say to Stan, John explained to everybody that you're not feeling well, and it's so great you came anyway because you want to disappoint everybody. But as he explained, we're only doing 20 minutes. So is there anything you want to say to the folks before we go off stage? And Stan looks at me and he says, is God talking to you? Did he say we have to stop? I feel great. Let's keep going. So everybody backstage is like flashing me signs that I have no idea what they mean. And I went, okay, let's keep. And so, I think, and then we went about another 10 minutes, I think, and then finally we were able to get him off stage. But I've seen that happen, not just with many people who either elderly or ill or both. I remember it happened I did an event with Harvey Picar once. I think it happens, of course, classically in show business, where it looks like somebody can barely stand up, but you get them on stage, especially if they're natural performers like Stan was, and it really energizes them. But it was very funny. So that's certainly a defining story of who Stan was and what made him tick, I think, and just very funny that. What are you talking about? I feel great.
Danny, that's a perfect story to introduce people who might have been thinking to themselves, okay, so what can I read when it comes to the amazing story of Stan Lee and A Marvelous Life that I haven't heard already? If you haven't heard that story, which I never had, well, you can look forward to it and many others in the book that you just had published and printed and released back in November. And I'm sure there's more than a few.
And if you've in any way, shape, or form enjoyed hearing me blather on this show, I did the audiobook. So the audiobook is available. Oh, wow. So which actually
I love it when the author reads their own book.
Yeah, it was fun. I was glad I had the chance to do it. Although I have to say, when you read your own book, you do discover every single typo or word you repeated more than you should have, or word that you should have used instead, or every misplaced comma. But it was fun, and I think I think that sense of it being fun comes through on the audiobook. So if you're an audiobook person and you've made it this far through this podcast, then you might you might want to check that out too. And there's a large print book coming out, large print version coming out. So we got everything covered. A lot of foreign languages, I think Italian and Slavic and Spanish and even a version in England. I guess they must have changed color to color and elevator to lift or something. But anyway, yeah. So
theater has that E at the end now.
Right.
I said theater. Theater has that E at the end now. And
exactly.
Yeah, that's a great introduction.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's people seem to like the book. As I said, it was a Times of London Book of the Year and a sci-fi website pick, and it was on the NPR homepage. So it's gotten a lot of it's gotten good feedback from. I tried to make the book so it had enough inside baseball that if you are a comics fan, there's stuff that you might not have known and points of view you might not have seen, but not so inside that it would alienate people who were not super immersed in it. So I think I touched those bases, and I say the depth is there if you're interested in it. But I try to structure it really like a novel, like a story that. And luckily Stan's life lent itself to that.
Wow. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Now, Danny, because people might want to follow up with you, they didn't hear the title right, they have other questions, they want to contact you. I mean, you've got your website, DannyFingeroth.com.
Right.
They can find information about you. You know, there's a great clip about the book. How else can they reach out to you on social media? This is basically my chance to let you tell everyone where they can find you. And I know you're going to be at some cons soon as well.
Right.
So tell us everywhere you're going to be and how we can reach you.
Well, Danny at DannyFingeroth.com. And in case you didn't know how to spell Fingeroth, it's Fingeroth. I'm on Facebook, Danny Fingeroth. I'm at Danny Fingeroth on Twitter. I'm going to be doing a bunch of cons. I guess the big news is that I'm going to be one of the special guests at the San Diego Comic-Con in July.
Awesome.
I'm also going to be at the Heroes Con in Charlotte in June. I will be at the East Coast Comic-Con in New Jersey in May. I will be at the Old School Big Little Giant, I'm forgetting the name, one-day convention in New Hampshire in April. I'm sure I'm forgetting some other things. I'll be doing this Will Eisner Week thing in New York at Parsons with the great John Lind on the 3rd. And boy, oh boy, I must be forgetting some other appearances. But I'm still in the process of plugging the book and promoting the book. So if anybody does want me to come to speak at their venue about Will Eisner, Stan Lee, the history of comics, history of Jews in comics, how to write comics, how to edit comics, any of that stuff, please feel free to contact me. I love speaking to crowds. I'm told I'm a halfway decent speaker, and just in case I'm not, I pretty much always bring a PowerPoint slideshow. So even if I'm boring, the slides will be exciting. So that's DannyFingeroth.com, as I say, is probably the best place to find me.
Well, Danny, I know I've enjoyed every minute of our conversation. I wish I'd booked out a few more hours so we could keep talking.
Well, I'm available. I'm available for a follow-up. So
that's great. I love the chance to catch up with you again, talk more. When you were talking about the Spider-Man book, I was reminded when I saw Deadly Foes about how many friends I knew freaked out when that book was coming out. All of their excitement about what it was going to see these guys take Spidey down, and It was there's so much in there. That my introduction to Darkhawk. There's a lot of fun stuff I would love to follow up with you on, and also just some of the other concepts you brought up. Jewish history in comics, and a lot of other great topics that I think we could have more great conversations. I know that when you're close to me, I'm going to come see you wherever you appear, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Oh, great.
And I just want to say thank you again, man.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Idea. Yeah, I had no idea that this is what I would get involved with when I touch bases with Will Eisner, talking about Will Eisner Week. And when they introduced me to you, it was just an amazing blessing. And this conversation has just been a really great gift.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Again, thank you, sir.
This has been great. So hopefully to be continued. Okay, so...
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for that. Thanks to everyone who was with us today and listening. You've got all those great ways to reach out to Danny. I always leave information at the end for how to reach out to me. Stay tuned for that. I'm going to let Danny go because he's also an extremely busy guy, and I've gotten a great deal of time from him, to which I'm extremely thankful.
And don't forget Will Eisner Week. Will Eisner Week. Celebrate Will.
Without question. Will Eisner Week, starting on March 1st, running through March 7th, or throughout the rest of the year. If you want to make it longer, whatever your definition of a week is, I'm not here to stop or influence you. But that's when I know it officially starts, when I'll make sure that this is posted, ready to share, and you've got both of us to reach out to for any follow-up questions. Can't wait to have another conversation with Danny Fingeroth.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Click the link below to subscribe now to Storytelling with Seth, or look for it on your favorite podcast platform.